Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for attending. I know Will says this is another in the series of FIA webinars, but this is quite a novel approach for us. This is the first Facades SIG forum, and it's potentially a series of regular events. Today, you've got, I'm afraid, just myself, Peter Wilkinson, and John talking today. Due to the way the webinar is set up, you have been muted. If you answer your questions via the Q&A function, then we'll do our best to answer them all at the end. Like I said, the Facades SIG is a novel special interest group, and it's a bit of a joint venture between the Institution of Fire Engineers and the Fire Industry Association, because it recognises that cross-industry issues that affect both the individual practitioner and fire engineering companies. It was launched earlier this year. And I'm a member of the SIG. I'm a chartered engineer, and I've just asked John to introduce himself.
Hello, yeah, I'm John Pagan, technical head of International Fire Consultants. I think many on the list will know me. So yes, I'm chairman of the Fire Engineering Council of the Fire Industry Association. So the Fire Industry Association has a number of different councils covering a variety of different areas, fire detection, fire extinguishing, etc. And so the Fire Engineering Council has been in existence for a few years and represents fire engineering companies. And I'm chairman of that council. So yes, we wanted to particularly set this up to try and draw on the strengths of both the IFE and the FIA, and particularly on a highly important topic of facades, fire safety in facades. It's an area where there has already been a lot of work going on, but I think it was particularly wanted something that we can try and help coordinate that, and particularly in terms of help and support for fire engineers operating in the industry.
Thanks, John. And what we're going to try and cover in the next 10 minutes, quarter of an hour or so, is give you a bit of background to the SIG, share with you more about the SIG and its objectives, the planned outputs, especially the outputs of the first steering group meeting. And then what we want to do is ask you what you'd like to see the SIG look at. So it's very much a fact-finding mission at the end of this presentation. So, the Special Interest Group exists to benefit all IFE and FIA members, but it has to be constituted and coordinated, and it's coordinated by a steering group. The steering group is co-chaired by John and also engineer Roy Little. We've got membership including David Crowder, Jason Hill, Jim McGonigal, Merle Horror, Adam Ross, Danny Hopkin, Mostyn Bullock, and myself. So on the left-hand side of the page there, we're all IFE members, practicing fire engineers, and there are quite a few individuals within that group who are actually at the cutting edge of undertaking research into facades. So we've got a real strong engineering background in the group that's helping to steer this special interest group. We also have some co-opted members on the steering group who bring with them important perspectives from outside of the institution. So we have David Metcalf from CWCT, Gary Strong from RICS, Charles from MHCLG, and a couple of representatives from NFCC who bring that valuable perspective. One of the important elements of our very first meeting was to agree our terms of reference. And I think it's worth just taking a bit of time looking at these so that we can all understand why the special interest group has been formed and what it is we're trying to do. So it really is to provide that focus for the organisation's activities in relation to the fire safety aspects of facades. And really so that when we get important questions that come into us, when we need to be talking to government, when we need to be responding to consultations, we've got some subject matter expertise within our group that we can go and rely on. We want to ensure that members of both organisations are aware of the work that's going on, what is happening, and encourage as much involvement as we can in these activities to the institution and the association and their memberships, so that everyone can benefit from the outcome of these activities. We want to identify and monitor existing research and guidance that's available. That's going to be important so that we can provide some signposting for the current best practice and best knowledge that's out there. We want to be a forum for the exchange of ideas. And what we thought was particularly important is thinking about consistent approaches to common problems that we find when we're considering fire safety and facades. We want to identify work streams related to facades or emerging issues, particularly those that we feel do not have good enough or any guidance at the moment. And then the Special Interest Group has to establish an annual work plan and have that agreed by the IFE's Technical Committee, which is known as TSAG, so that we can monitor that work during the course of each year. Ultimately, we want to be raising the awareness of issues affecting facades, and we see this as a two-way thing. It's a mechanism to pass and receive information to and from the fire engineering community. So what did we discuss in our first steering group meeting? Well, the aims, objectives and the terms of reference were discussed, agreed and signed off. We discussed a bit about what the Special Interest Group is not. So we're adamant that the SIG should not become a drop-in centre to deal with individual problems. We spent a bit of time trying to identify and then review current and ongoing research items. And you can see here, we have identified several projects that government have commissioned recently, and many of which have an impact on facades. Now, what's important is I've included some hyperlinks to the 4 highlighted there, which have got particular relevance to facades. So there's balconies, spandrels and laminated glass. A research project looking at trigger heights and thresholds. Another one looking at classification of external wall construction review. And one looking at construction technologies and design. All 4 of these can have an impact on our considerations when we're thinking about the fire safety in facades. So once this PowerPoint is posted on those websites, you'll be able to hover over, click the link, the hyperlink, and see the research specifications for those 4 projects. Now, we're aiming to keep an eye on these projects and then being able to disseminate the output of them to everyone here, the wider group, the wider fire engineering community.
Just if I could just say that particular one there, I think is a key part of the information we want to give out on this forum, because we want to make sure that the SIG is providing information out to the general community about what work is going on, and so you can see that there is research in a number of different areas ongoing. Some of it, is publicly available, it's on there, but not necessarily everyone was aware of it. So things like laminated glass, what risk does laminated glass present? There's obviously a variety of different opinions on that, but there is some research being carried out on that. So that's good to know that it's happening. Obviously, it's not being completed yet, as and when it will be. It'll be disseminated presumably, but at least the community, obviously anyone logging in on this at least now knows that there is some research on that, and you can click on that link to see what the research project involves, who's carrying it out, and any other information that's publicly available for it.
Thanks, John. I think at the end of our first steering group meeting, we decided an initial action plan. We held the meeting on the very day that the PAS 9980 consultation was launched. We responded to that. There was a coordinated FIA and IFE effort to create a response to the consultation, and that the consultation response is posted on the IFE's consultation page. And we also agreed that we would do things like hold an online forum to encourage wider engagement. And thankfully, we've followed through on that action point, and here we are today. And we do want your feedback, because if we all agree that this kind of event is useful in getting that dialogue going and disseminating the good work that goes on in a SIG, then we want to keep on doing these kind of things. We also looked at trying to identify the primary challenges that the SIG will be looking at, and I think John, you can explain to us how this sort of falls into two camps.
Yeah, I think just particularly in terms of the work that we carry out, I find that there are two main areas of issues relating to external walls. The first one is to do with existing buildings. So there are existing buildings. You have to then carry out how do you assess the fire risk that presents? In particular, is there's an existing building. You need to try and find out, investigate it, look into it, find out what's there, and find out, is it currently acceptable? Is there any particular issues under that? If you do remedial works particularly need to be carried out, and what and if the risk is unacceptable, and what other issues do you need to do beyond that. So in particular, that's going to be impacted by things like the Fire Safety Act, which is extending or clarifying, depending on your point of view, the fire safety order to cut. So the fire risk assessments will definitely have to cover external walls of residential buildings. And so there's a whole raft of work needed around that area to try and facilitate that. Separately, there is also the work to do with new buildings, particularly tall buildings, where you realistically are not allowed to use any significant amount of combustible materials. And if anything, I find the difficulties there is complying with Regulation 7. It is such a strict, onerous, prescriptive regulation. It is actually very, very hard to comply with and very easy to not comply with. And so that is an area when we're working on new builds that we put a significant amount of effort into that. And there's a number of questions and interpretations and things on that to do with Regulation 7, which is almost a sort of separate topic area from the work to do with existing buildings. So there's certain things that might overlap between the two, but there are a large number of topics that really they're just going to be covering either one or the other. And so when we're sorting out things like the work, the plans for the work and so on, we will be making sure that we try and cover both of those areas.
Thank you. So they were our primary issues or primary challenges that we are considering, and we do know that there are other issues that are going to trouble us, and we'll have to give due consideration to. There's the tricky and worsening situation about professional indemnity insurance that isn't going to be a primary engineering concern for the SIG, but it's clearly something that we will be discussing. And as John mentioned, when the Fire Safety Act comes into force, we've got to be cognizant of the fire risk assessment process and the interface between the engineering aspects and what our fire risk assessor colleagues will be doing. Just to give a bit of update on professional indemnity insurance. I mean, I'm sorry that I haven't got any better news to give, but you'll probably be aware that it was announced that MHCLG is creating a government-backed PII scheme for EWS1 surveys. And there's going to be a further announcement very soon, and I'll be writing to IFE registrants about this scheme in the very, very near future, probably over the weekend. But at every opportunity when we're talking with government, and that's several times a week at the moment, we keep raising the fact that the hardening PII market is affecting fire engineering sector much wider than just EWS. Fire risk assessment, fire engineering in general, most practitioners I speak to are struggling to get professional indemnity insurance. If they do manage to get it, then it's got some onerous exclusion clauses that prevents them from even discussing a facade, and it's clearly crippling what we do. At IFE, we've been in talks with several brokers and underwriters with the aim of creating some kind of IFE scheme. And I know that FIA have Aon as a broker who look after a lot of fire-related companies. Aon are a very large broker, and they're not finding any routes through for PII for fire engineering. And we've been in conversations with well, the biggest broker in the world, Marsh, and unsuccessful so far. There are still some conversations happening, but unfortunately, no positive news to report as of yet. And unfortunately, these discussions with the insurance sector seems to suggest that the market may harden further before things get better. And there seems to be some suggestion that there's an element of market adjustment going on here. And it might be the fact that we'll never get back to the low, comparatively low premiums that we were used to several years ago. Right.
I think just on that topic, I mean, insurance, I'm assuming in any Q&A that there's going to be some questions on that. So I think that's why when Peter and I discussed it, we have a bit of an intro on that. We know it's awful, the PI insurance. There's exclusions, and then there's massive premiums, and it's, yeah, there is work going on that. It's, you know, there are lots of people trying to talk to them, but it is largely driven by lots of large claims going on. That's, you know, if you're an insurer and there are lots of claims going on, then you're going to have to charge probably big premiums and cover yourself for that. So there are things that can be done to try and reduce it, but it's not going to go away. It is going to be an issue with us going to be with us for, you know, for the medium term at least. And realistically, we, you know, to a certain extent, we will just have to, you know, accept the fact that there will be larger premiums and restrictions. Hopefully, we can try and nibble away at it, at the edges of it, try and minimise it. But there is no quick fix solution for that. Lots of people are trying. But it's something that we are going to have to deal with.
Thanks, John. So for the next half hour or so, we've got a bit of time to take your questions, but really we want some feedback. We want to know what you would like to see the SIG consider on your behalf, what you'd like us to address. I'd like feedback on whether this style of forum is a worthwhile endeavour if we try and do it on a relatively regular basis, at least after each of the steering group meetings, and really try and understand the real pressing issues that our membership are experiencing when it comes to fire safety and facades. So, have we got many questions on our Q&A list?
Yeah, please type your questions into the Q&A panel. We haven't got any at the moment, so there is one on the chat. It's a lot easier if you use the Q&A. That's when we see them all easier. But is it within the scope for the SIG to consider what is safety tolerable / acceptable and advise and lobby government accordingly?
I mean, that realistically, this is a relatively new area. There is, until recently, there hasn't even been a method for assessing the risk of external walls. PAS 9980 is presumably going to be that method. There's a draft for public comment. It's going to be out as a published document. Either later this year, at some point, as once they've been through all of the comments. So that'll be the process for assessing the risk within external walls. There is, within any risk assessment process, then there has to be an engineering judgment as to what might be acceptable. And I do appreciate that there's going to be varying opinions on that, depending on the assessment. With anything like this, then that's part of, that will happen. There is no sort of absolute fixed line as to what which absolutely everyone accepts. There may need to be more work to try and develop some examples about what things might be acceptable or not. I have to say, I don't know for sure. I think we'll have to see how that works out, to try and provide some kind of level of consistency within the industry, because I have noticed that there have been significant variations. Some people taking a very harsh line and expecting everything to be fully compliant with the with the standards that were in at that point, in effect at the time of construction, whereas others taking a more risk-based approach of saying, well, okay, it wasn't compliant, but still, based on my judgment, I think the risk is acceptable. I think the way it is going is that there's obviously, following the Grenfell Tower fire, it was reasonable that it's not unexpected to have a reaction against that and to expect a sort of quite a strict approach. But I think people are now realizing that you do have to, unless we want to do remedial works for like the entire country, then you do have to have a level of risk tolerance, and that's what you do tend to have with existing buildings. Even when you do fire risk assessments for existing buildings, you have to have a level of risk tolerance in there and that's the same for external walls as any other part of the building. Exactly how do you define that is a question, and exactly how do you provide some sort of benchmarks to try and maintain some kind of consistency between different engineers is also going to be a question. But I think we probably can't do. That'll presumably be along some kind of line from PAS 9980. When that's out, then maybe we can start producing, getting some kind of consistency as to for those issues. I don't know, Peter, have you got any other views on that?
Other than to say I agree with what you've just said there, John. No, absolutely. It is something that the SIG will probably be discussing at some stage in the future, and we'll be able to talk about that at future forums. We've got a few questions in now. Can I take the one about? Well, there's a question here. I understand there's going to be a Home Office tool coming out to prioritise reassessing FRAs of residential buildings. Does the SIG know what's the latest on this? Well, I understood that Home Office is devising a risk prioritisation tool for the enforcement or the inspection of fire and rescue services, to try and prioritise that resource. We're going to have more discussions with the Home Office at the end of next week, so we'll be able to feedback some more then. But clearly, guidance documents from the Home Office or others before the Fire Safety Act is enforced need to come out quite quickly, don't they? So hopefully that will be made public quite soon.
Yeah, I was, if that's the same one, I was actually on a panel that was putting that together about it, just under a year ago or so. It was trying to find a tool for, I think that the main priority for it was actually for organisations that have a large number of buildings to try and identify which ones that they need to be focusing on first. So it was going to be a sort of way of relatively balancing which one's going to be higher priority than others. It wasn't necessarily an absolute risk prioritisation tool. Essentially the approach was not far away from the PAS 9980, in that picked up a number of different factors, such as, you know, what type of materials you got, height, occupancy, you know, whether you got balconies, you know, materials, things like that, and then you try and, you know, put it together into an overall risk score. So the principles of it is was very similar to the approach that's on PAS 9980. I don't know, but that was a while, several months ago when that group finished, and I haven't really seen what's happened since then. So there may be more happening. I think there's been a couple of messages put on the chat. I think like Will said, if we could put the messages onto the Q&A, please. It's easier for us to be, you know, looking at all in one system rather than on two.
Okay, at a time when the industry needs advice from fire engineers on facades, are you able to offer any advice what members can do to put themselves in the best possible position to get PI insurance? Well, it's a very good question. I did spoke to a few brokers and tried to get some hints and tips on how, especially smaller practices, can present their firm in the best light when trying to obtain PII. And whilst clearly competence is a key driver, also risk management within your practice is a really important factor that insurers want to understand and see defined well. I think it was in my January update that went out on IFE's e-news that had an additional sheet of hints and tips. I'll perhaps make sure that we dig that out and stick it on our Facades SIG website, if that would be helpful. Unfortunately, though, I think whatever we do, the situation's pretty dire. So I've recently only heard of success in renewal by the larger practices who have sort of a diversified offering, perhaps with multidisciplinary engineers. So the element of fire safety or looking at facades is relatively small. But yes, I will try and make sure that we get that on the Facades SIG website, and that might be some help.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, actually. I mean, it's such a huge issue. We've got, you know, there's a number of, you know, each company does have discussions with PI insurers, but there might be a number of standard things that might be useful for people to focusing on, like, you know, quality control processes, risk reduction measures. How much can you demonstrate to the insurers that you are trying to minimise the risks as much as you can. So yes, that's maybe something we could look at.
What's next? We've got one on Regulation 7 there, John. Is that... Oh
yes, another compliance to Regulation 7. Lack of definitions of terms presents a lot of difficulty, and an example is with fire stopping being excluded. But does that include cavity barriers? Yes, I would see that cavity. I think it's, if looking at the definitions of the you know, within the regulations, I would see that cavity barriers would be particularly, you know, excluded. I think particularly in, you know, intumescence when it's talking about those. So yes, because intumescence are not, you know, I'm not going to fully comply, so they're excluded items. ADB clear definitions. I find that there's a number of different terms under Regulation 7 which are open to interpretation, and there's a wide variety of interpretations beyond that. LABC Warranty actually have a website which has a large number of interpretations of a variety of topics, which I have to say I find incredibly useful. It covers, you know, there's a good sort of 60 or 70 different items that covers, you know, a whole wide variety of things, you know, including things like, you know, parapets, are they covered, and you know, the, you know, and wind, you know, adhesives, you know, the differences between adhesives are not specifically excluded, but if they're used as a seal, then they might be excluded. So whereas if you're just, so you can use an adhesive to seal something, but you can't use an adhesive just to hold something in place. Those are in there. So They also give a number of things or criteria saying, well, yes, these are either is this indisputable? Say certain things are yes or no. Other things it might be open to the interpretation of the company, of the organisation. So I know NHBC doesn't necessarily agree with all of those interpretations, but I personally do tend to agree with most of them. We can give a link to that on the when we're circulating it, but it's the LABC warranty site.
Brilliant. I'm making a note of these things. Well, I've got a question about more of a comment. I've recently enrolled on the RICS External Wall Assessment course. Input from SIG's SMEs will really help me to develop and understand the assessment process. But without a PI scheme in place, I'm wondering whether it's worth potentially wasting my time on the course. I would encourage you, if you're enrolled and started on it, I would stick with it. Graduating from that course does make you eligible for the government's backed PII scheme. So if that's something that might be of interest to you, I would stick with the course. I mean,
presumably also.
I've heard that it's really good. I've heard that it's pretty useful anyway, and would be fantastic learning for you. So stick with it, please.
Yeah, presumably that would also be something if you're having discussions with insurers that's going to show that you are got good quality control. That people involved in it have been on on the relevant course to do that.
Sure.
There's a question from Simon Vickers saying one issue we've recently been encountering is the provision with unitized panel systems that are manufactured off-site, and in particular the provision of cavity barriers. Is this an area that the SIG are intending to be looking at? Yeah, we have to say we come across that as well. There are definitely issues about that, because realistically, if you're going to be inspecting that, you've got to be inspecting them in the factory, and if the factory is in China, which they often are, then that does introduce some issues. So I don't know whether or not whether the SIG will be specifically planning on creating guidance on that, because that is part of the sort of quality control process that you'd be needing to do when you're if you've got a job where you're being asked to look at that. If you're being asked to sign off materials and make sure that the building as built is compliant with Regulation 7, you'd need to make sure that the materials used in the construction are compliant, which would which would probably include checking the factories and having some kind of, but if that's in fact in China, then that's very difficult. You're also going to have questions there as to if they start trying to source local materials, then will those local materials have the relevant testing to demonstrate compliance with Regulation 7? It might be still perfectly safe, but it's it's a prescriptive regulation. So I don't know at this point in time whether we'd be looking at that. I think that probably could, there would be some would be useful to sort of try and get some guidance together as to how people might be considering good practice for compliance with Regulation 7. For example, use of things like a materials register, something that we as a company always use. We just say we will simply not work on a project if we are being asked to comply with, confirm compliance with Regulation 7. We will only do that on the basis of a materials register. I would see that as good practice, because if you can't do it based on reviewer drawings, because there's so many materials shown in there, and so there might be a variety of other good practice methods that that could be put together. So relevant, good point, and maybe we can be looking at that.
I just need to give a bit of clarity that when I said that completion of the RICS course is a route to the government's PII scheme, I should have said it is one route to the government's PII scheme. Like I said earlier, I'll be communicating with IFE registrants about another route to it over the weekend. So no, it doesn't mean that that's the only way in. Right, what else have we got?
The question on trade associations insuring their members, yeah, in theory, the trade association could. In practice, your membership fees are going to skyrocket, and I personally don't think you're going to be happy with that. So that's why it's not going to happen.
I mean, it's a whole area, and the reason why premiums are high is because there are there are lots of claims, very, very big claims in some instances. So it's not as if the insurers are just profiteering; they are basically dealing with the fact that that if there are huge amounts of claims going around in the industry, then they're going to be wary about going into it, and if they do, they're going to charge huge premiums. So if others, I mean, I've heard about suggestions about mutual insurance and trade bodies, things like that. I don't think that gets around that. If if anyone's going to be getting involved in doing that, you've got to charge big premiums if there's big risk. So the ways of doing it are to reduce the risk, and then over time, hopefully, the premiums will come down.
Yeah, good point. Right, I agree with this. It's the last comment we have here. Government needs to be asked to clarify what the expectation is regarding fire risk assessment process of external facades once the Fire Safety Act comes into force. Is the SIG a vehicle for this? If fire risk assessors are expected to make clear comment on the facade, PI insurance with exclusions effectively bars the assessor from doing this. It does, doesn't it? And not only, well, I think the question in there is the SIG a vehicle for this? It's probably bigger than the SIG. I think IFE and FIA are the vehicle for this, and we are reminding the government of the implications of what's happening, and asking for clarity. In fact, hopefully facilitating some discussion which will come out with some actions and some clarity in the very near future. But I fully appreciate the question and the sentiment of that one.
Sorry, I was interrupting you. Go. Sorry, you finish.
I was just going to say, there's a lot of work to be done in the next month to really clarify what the expectation is on the fire risk assessor for any type of building that they're doing the assessment in. How deep is their decision on or their description of the construction, the external wall construction meant to be, and also how do they make a decision on whether further intrusive studies are required. And as you've quite rightly pointed out, PII clearly impacts on that as well.
Yeah. On that topic, the FIA's view, because the FIA also has a council for fire risk assessors, and they've put together a document a few months ago where they covered this topic to a certain extent. Their view is that the Act does extend the fire safety order. It doesn't clarify it, because they're saying that their view is that the fire safety order never covered it in the first place. So, and it is an important item to be mentioning that, because if they're saying if it's just clarifying it, then essentially that does mean that every fire risk assessment that's been done in the past 20 years or 20 years or whatever, 15 years or so, that didn't cover external walls is not suitable and sufficient, and those which would obviously be quite a significant issue. So they are saying that it never did cover it. They're also saying that your typical fire risk assessor simply does not have the competence for doing an external wall fire risk review. It's not that it's a specialist area that needs extensive and detailed investigation, and from a specialist who knows that area. So realistically, their view is that you're going to essentially end up with two. For doing a fire risk assessment, you're pretty much going to get two assessments. There will be your conventional fire risk assessment that you've done right now, which would either not cover external walls or cover them to a limited extent. And then if you need a separate inspection of the external wall, then that would be carried out by a specialist. So they would be calling and saying you need, kind of like if you're saying, well, we've got to look at the structural fire protection or the smoke ventilation system, they'd say you'd have to call a specialist in to look at that. The only question would be are there certain situations where the fire risk assessor can say, well, based on my external inspection from the outside of it, the risk is so low that I don't think you need to do that. And that's going to be a question, because as to what situations can they do that, and what's their basis for doing it, and is that consistent? Because if you then get another fire risk assessor coming along a year later and saying, well, I don't disagree with that, you now do need one, then it's going to lead to inconsistency. So, but, and there are, like you said in the question, if you're actually barred from, if your PI insurance doesn't cover external walls, you're going to have to essentially take option A, just not even, in your quotes, basically saying, I'm sorry, I can't do external walls. I'll look at every other part of it, but we're going to exclude external walls simply because I don't have insurance to cover that part of it. Even a basic assessment of whether you're going to be recommending a more detailed inspection or not, you're just going to have to exclude it. But I think there's definitely some more work needed on that to clarify it, because that's kind of what I've been picking up as to the way it's been likely to go. I can't guarantee that's definitely the way it's going to go, but it's, that's kind of what I've been seeing from some of the discussions, and particularly that there's an FIA guidance document, a document relating to this. Again, you might be worthwhile, interested in having a look at that, because it also gives some guidance to put into quotes, which I think would explain that, and exclude external walls from the scope.
The important bit is that decision that the fire risk assessor has to make, and that's the bit that needs the clarity. A couple of interesting comments I think have just popped in.
David, yes, that maybe we're probably getting into sort of technical questions that you could get into sort of quite a lot of legal arguments on that. I mean, I think the worry is, is someone going to have a go at suing a fire risk assessor because their fire risk assessment didn't include external walls? And to be honest, we don't even want to be getting into those arguments, because one of the things that really does affect your PI insurance is if you've had any claims landing on you, and even if they're spurious claims, then it's not going to help getting PI insurance. So I appreciate that the government may have phrased it in a way as clarifying it because for other reasons, but there's definitely differences of opinion on that topic, which we're not going to be able to really clarify here, I'm afraid.
I think it's interesting that our special interest group has a lot of engineering expertise in the steering group membership, and yet a lot of the kind of things we're discussing now are perhaps the fire risk assessment interface with facades. Maybe we should be looking to make sure that our steering group remains appropriately representative of our members and their needs. I'll write that down as well. So I think I think Will's just posted on the chat link the link right to the FIA guidance. Is that the guidance on? The issue, that's the issue I was just discussing. So that's the one where they're particularly, so that's the one I was mentioning.
Yeah, that's the link to the guidance on the issue of flooding and external wall construction for fire risk assessments, which has the boilerplate exclusion language.
Right. Thank you, Will.
Civil training for risk assessors, very few who are chartered or incorporated engineers. There is going to be a question about what competence levels are required for doing these inspections. It's right now, it's kind of restricted under EWS1 forms, but also under things like the CAS 9980, recommending that it's chartered or incorporated engineers under that. There are limited amounts of sort of training courses, things on there. Not all chartered or incorporated engineers have competence in these areas anyway. So at least if you think part of the point of specifying it to that level is that you've got a professional membership behind you, that if you decide to operate outside your professional competence levels, then potentially you could have that withdrawn, and then you could essentially lose your career. So that's the one of the reasons for doing it something like that, to make sure that people are, self-limiting their, the areas that they work in, because if you don't have some kind of restrictions on it, then we do know it. Anyone is, in the past, anyone's had a look at these things. And I know when they were setting up the panel that put together the EWS1 forms, prior to that, they were getting letters from estate agents and Dave down the road saying, yes, the external wall's fine. And obviously the banks were not trusting those in the slightest, so they needed to find some criteria. I think so there might be in the future training, things like that, and assessing the competency requirements for looking at the external walls. That's still going to be developed, but right now it's still largely restricted to chartered engineers and incorporated engineers.
I think there's a real need for training for the fire risk assessor to be making that important decision in their assessment as to whether further investigation is needed or not. I think that's an area that, first of all, needs some clarification. But next of all, I think we can assist with developing some training in that area. I think that needs some work.
There's a comment from an anonymous attendee about saying LA fire services have criticised fire risk assessments which do not mention flat entrance doors and external walls. I'd say yes, the FIA note does actually say, obviously the Fire Safety Act extends the fire safety order, so it covers external walls, doors and structure actually. But the fire safety, the FIA document agrees with them in relation to flat entrance doors. They said this says that it always did cover that, and that was agreed, and there was guidance that was saying you should look at those, and so there's total agreement that flat entrance doors were always within the remit of the fire safety order. But then in terms of external walls, that's where they're saying, well, it never really was, and so they're disagreeing with it on as far as that's concerned.
Does anyone else have any more questions? Final few minutes to ask a question.
Looks like it might be it for now. I think I'm hoping this has been useful for people. I have to say, I've found
there's one comment in the chat saying that such sessions, if they're held regularly, and any recent issues related to the facades fire can be discussed. So essentially saying that this type of forum is useful. If anyone else has any comments around that, we would be happy to receive them.
Yeah, so I've picked up a few things that definitely something that we can be adding to the agenda of future meetings, the meetings. So I think what our plan is that we're going to be, that's what we're hoping to get from this. So partly sort of passing some information out about things that were discussed in the previous SIG, but also getting things back, so any other areas that you guys might want us to look at, and then we will then add that to the agenda. We'll then start to discuss, and then I think the idea would be maybe we can have this kind of forum. I think we'll be having meetings roughly once every quarter, something like that, and we'll be aligning these forums with those meetings at a similar sort of frequency. So we start sort of have a similar sort of thing, feedback, any progress that we're having on those, and giving information feedback to the industry. I can take a look at balcony assessment, because in order to do that, assessors need to enter the flat. The fire safety order does not extend past the front entrance doors. Well, when you're saying the fire safety order, when it's extended by the Fire Safety Act, will clearly cover balconies. I think that's in external walls, and I think it covers attachments as well, doesn't it, from memory? Sorry, yes. It's been a while since I looked at it. So I don't. I think the balconies will clearly be needed. There will need to be an inspection of balconies, and yes, I appreciate sometimes that is difficult to do without getting access through a flat. But that's one of that is one of those difficulties. Sometimes you can see from ground level about them. sometimes you do need to, but I mean, that would be part of essentially the external wall inspection as well. I mean, I think because balconies, you often can't really, sometimes you can tell what materials it's made of just by looking at it from the outside, but sometimes you can't. So, if you've got a panel and you look up and you just got some kind of soffit panel there, you've got to take the soffit panel up or apart, or look through it to see whether there's any insulation or combustible material on the underside. So that's, I would see that really as part of the external wall inspection. On the other hand, what you might, what we typically would do is when we've got a building where we're doing an inspection, we would highlight management of the balconies as a key management function anyway, that they need to be making sure there's a limit to the combustible material stored on there, and the use of the balconies for things like barbecues and smoking to try and limit that, which hopefully then would be picked up in the fire risk assessment when those are carried out.
And don't forget that balconies is one of the topics of the ongoing research projects, and so it might be nice to think that some interesting information will come out from that, which might help us to understand when what we see is good or not so good. Great. Well, I've had a few comments in the chat saying that the format of this forum is useful, so that's good to hear. I think we'll commit to continuing this type of event, and great that not many people were put off by late on a Friday afternoon. That's good.
There is a question about whether the SIG is open to new members. We are looking at the membership on it. We'll have to decide what the membership is. One thing is that once the members are on, you want to make sure that the membership isn't too big to the point where the meetings become unmanageable. So, but we need to make sure there's the appropriate level of competence on that group. And once people are on, it's difficult to kind of remove them, really. So I think we'll probably stick with the membership that we've currently got for now, as and when we might, review it. We might review it over time to see whether or not we want to expand it. But we do not want the meetings just to end up with a talking shop. It's got to be something that's productive. And so we've currently got.
I was going to say that's membership of the steering group, because we can all participate in the outputs of the SIG, and that's why actually one of the exact reasons we're doing this kind of forum is so that everyone can be part of the learning from Facades Special Interest Group. All our members are part of it if they choose to participate in things like this. But yes, it's difficult to get the balance right in a steering group, so that we've got the right skills and not an unwieldy amount of participants that means that progress is unnecessarily slow. Right. Are we getting towards that time, Will?
I think we probably are. I'd probably suggest calling it a day at that point. Coming up to 5 o'clock on a Friday. I think it's been really useful. So fantastic! Thank you everyone for joining. It's been really useful to have the feedback, and we will definitely take this back to the next meeting. We'll see what we can do on those. I'd love to promise that we'll solve all of these problems by the next meeting, but that would be a total lie. We will do what we can to try and at least identify them and see what progress we can make. But a lot of these problems are difficult, ongoing problems that are going to be with us for years. So we can do what we can to sort of deal with it gradually over time or minimize things. But it's and at least hopefully part of the purpose of this forum is so that you all can see that there is work ongoing on these things, even if we haven't managed to solve the problems. At least you know that there's someone trying, and there are lots of people out there trying. It's just want some visibility to that. So
and please make your way to the IFE website, find the page for the Facades SIG, because that's where we'll be posting this PowerPoint and this recording of this event. I'll be adding that insurance document to it, and that will grow as the hub of the output from this special interest group. Hopefully, and any member can access that. Right. Thanks again for everyone's participation. I think that's been really productive, and have a great weekend.